Welcome everybody to the Neighborly Faith webinar here with Shadi Hamid and RR or Rusty Reno. We're going to take a minute and get all of our feeds going live. But until then, everyone get cozy, whatever that looks like. Just so you know, we can't see you, but you can see us. We are going to be taking your questions through the hour. And yeah, tune in and just hold on a second while we go live on all our channels. Well, awesome. Everyone, as you may know or may have been in some previous live streams of ours, this is not the first webinar that we've been doing because of the coronavirus. Neighborly Faith, a lot of our events went down and we were feeling really bummed. So we have been putting together dialogues like this for you in your home to kind of spend an hour each week thinking about some of the deeper issues and talking to some of the people that are able to give you some really great answers and dialogue about the things that as people of faith are really pressing during this time. Before we get to introducing our guests, I want to introduce our hosts. My name here is Chris Stackrick. I'm co-director of Neighborly Faith, which is an organization that seeks to build some really strong bridges between Christians and Muslims based upon mutual relationships, speaking truth to one another in love, and hopefully seeing a different kind of future for evangelicals, Christians and Muslims in America. My co-host is Salam, who I'll let introduce herself.
Hi guys, I am Salam Ibrahim and I'm a junior at NC State University majoring in industrial engineering, and I was introduced to Neighborly Faith just this year actually, and I'm really excited to be working with them.
Awesome. Salam did an event with us at North Carolina State University where we had, I think it was like over 1,000 people in a room who are Christians and Muslims talking about kind of their different way of thinking about hope in that age. And I think right now hope is probably an even more pressing issue. And we'll be talking about that. So how about we get to Salam? Can you tell us a bit about what we're going to be talking about today? And we'll get to our guests.
Of course. So from 8:05 until 8:35, we will have a dialogue moderated by Chris and I. And then from 8:35 until 8:50, we'll have some time for question and answer from the audience. So get your questions ready. And then we'll be closing from 8:50 until 9. So without further ado, we have Shadi Hamid and Rusty Reno. Shadi Hamid is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, and co-editor of Rethinking Political Islam. Shadi was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers of 2019 by Prospect magazine. And we also have Rusty Reno, and he is the editor of First Things magazine, a well-known journal on religion and public life. He was formerly a professor of theology and ethics at Creighton University, and is the author of many books including Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West, and Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society. So we are super excited to have you both here, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. This we do a lot of events, everybody, but a little more intro with Christians and Muslims coming together to talk about ways in which we see things differently, and hopefully we learn from each other. And also there might be some of the same. So today we're going to talk about the coronavirus. Are we handling it properly? And there's been a lot of amazing conversation about that. Without further ado, let's get to our guests and our questions. So the first one, we're all sitting at home and none of us have been to church or mosque or synagogue or wherever we go in a very long time. And the strange world in which we live is not what we thought we were going to be in 2020. And I want to know, both of you have been writing a lot about the scenario that we're in right now and how we are not going to worship. So I want to know, if this virus keeps up, how long do you think is too long for houses of worship to be shuttered? And how about we start with Rusty on this one?
Yeah, I think it's already been too long. I don't think that they should have been shut in the first place. I do think that the public authorities have good reasons, or may have good reasons, to want to impose restrictions. And so in New York, for instance, there's a limit of 10 people for any gathering. And I think that I don't see why we couldn't have tried to move forward on this very limited basis here in New York as a church. So I don't think they should have been shuttered in the first place. And, you know, I'm a bit of a renegade, so I go to an underground church here in New York. And so I have actually been to church. And there are churches here in New York that are open, and that's perfectly acceptable. People to come and pray on their own. I've been to confession that was set up by my local parish, again in conformity with public health guidelines. So I think it's possible for the churches to function in a limited way in the current climate and according to the current regulations. And it pains me that I'm a Catholic, it pains me that there are dioceses in which the Catholic Church is really effectively shut down altogether.
Thank you. Why don't we go over to Shadi? Shadi, what do you think? How long is too long for how's the worship to be shuttered?
Well, sure. So I'm more on the pro-lockdown side of the debate. And if it's interesting that if you look at various Muslim majority countries, some of them have stricter restrictions on going to mosques than say DC or New York, where there may be more room for, if you have under 10 people, you can maybe get together and all of that. In some Muslim countries, it's stricter, and you can't even leave your home unless you have permission in some countries. So I think that there are different approaches, and as long as it's temporary, I think that it's fine. And we're not talking about anything that will last more than a couple months, and already there's talk of reopening. So I think it's a minor inconvenience if the ultimate goal is to preserve life. And I guess in this respect, I'm coming at it from the Muslim perspective. One of the objectives of Sharia or Islamic law is the preservation of life, and that tends to trump other considerations in times of crisis. And one example that I often mention to people is, if you're Islamic scholars sometimes talk about very unlikely hypotheticals. So let's say you're in a desert and you're starving. That's one of the situations where you're allowed to eat pork. Now, obviously, there's no situation where you'll be in a desert and there'll just be pork, but it sort of captures this idea that there are exceptional situations where the normal rules and regulations of Islamic law are essentially suspended. And I think it's good to see that you have a lot of, the vast majority of Muslim scholars are drawing on these aspects of Islamic history and Islamic jurisprudence to do something which was initially quite controversial in Muslim countries, where you had protests and where people were saying, don't close the mosques. But that's a small minority. And I think it's also worth noting that we don't want religion to get a bad name. And there were some so-called super spreaders. So there was a large gathering in Malaysia in March of thousands of people, and that became one of the hot spots. And, as you don't want to get in this situation where secular folk are kind of pointing to religious people in America or other parts of the world and saying, look, they're refusing to lock down, they're refusing to respect these restrictions. That shows that religion is opposed to science. I mean, we don't want to fall into this kind of binary. And it's also on the other side, and I think we also see that, sometimes on the, secular or kind of anti-religious discourse. We're already seeing signs of that. And I think we have to be careful about feeding that divide, which is already present.
I mean, I would add.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I would. I think it. I mean, clearly, one can argue the epidemiology and so on, but the principle is correct. That, I mean, obviously, the suspension of public attendance of worship is not an existential spiritual crisis for Christians. This is something, as Shadi pointed out, that's for a temporary period of time. My only concern is what is the way in which religious leaders respond. Do they seek if you will, the sort of maximal openness to the spiritual side of things that's consistent with responsible behavior in a pandemic environment? And yeah, as I said, a lot of my friends are just kind of anguished by the fact that Christian leaders don't seem to want to really try to make those prudential judgments about where to draw the line, where to have that balance. I can go to the liquor store down the street and buy a bottle of bourbon, but I can't go to mass. And this I think is one reason why people are upset with the severity or the complete nature of the closure of the churches.
And I would just maybe add, one thing. So in principle, I'm not opposed to the idea of a slow reopening in the coming weeks where we think about ways to respect social distancing in houses of worship. As long as you have clear regulations and it's orderly, and let's say you have a limit on the number of people who can be in a particular hall or prayer room or whatever it might be, we can be creative about how we approach this. Just like there are regulations when you're going into grocery stores and you keep distance to the person in front of you and so on. So it doesn't have to be an either or thing. And I think we're probably in agreement on that there are people who want to make it an either or. And again, this idea that it's secular Americans who are rational, who are taking precautions. Look at those bad religious people who can't be trusted to observe regulations. And it shouldn't have to be one or the other.
Thank you. Oh, Salam, I think you're muted.
Thanks for the reminder. Thank you both. So during this hard season, how is the fear of death impacting Christians and Muslims? And do you guys think it's for better or worse?
Well, look, fear of death is a universal human phenomenon. I think it affects religious people just as much as it affects non-religious people. Religious people ought to have they ought to have less of a fear of death in the sense of having some confidence in eternal life. But I would say that it's not really fear of death that's primarily what troubles, or what's the right word? It's fear of causing the death of others that I think I see in my religious friends as being the dominant fear. And I think this all turns on, I think, a very modern notion that sort of all deaths are preventable deaths. And so if all deaths are preventable deaths, then any death is a consequence of negligence. And so if I go out and have a drink at my friend's house, and if somehow I communicate to him the virus, and then that he winds up communicating the virus to somebody else, who communicates it to somebody else who's living with his elderly grandmother gets it and dies, that I'm a kind of a murderer. And I think this is really what is animating religious folks. I think ultimately the belief that all deaths are preventable, really, it can be the basis of a fundamentally totalitarian approach to life. Because really, sort of anything that has the slightest element of risk to it becomes forbidden. And that's part of why we're in these lockdowns. Is based on this idea that a virus is causing people to die who need not die. In other words, but for, we have to do this in order to prevent their deaths. Obviously, at some level, it does make sense, and prudent behavior to reduce the risk to others is, of course, a duty. But in this case, it's been ratcheted up to such a high degree that I think a lot of my friends are kind of in a condition of moral terror. And that's much more powerful and I think disruptive than fear of their own death. People have that to a great lesser extent. And I think early in the crisis here in New York, I had friends who were worried that they would die from the virus. People, Salam, your age, my children were worried, even then we knew epidemiologically that it posed almost no risk to them. That message has gotten out more, and I think it's the fear about causing the death of others that's really the paralyzing fear. And that's what's preventing the churches from opening, not civil authority.
Yeah, so on this question, there was actually a pretty interesting Trump press briefing. I think this was probably 2 weeks ago, although my sense of time has become somewhat distorted, under lockdown, but I remember hearing it and tweeting about it because, so Trump said, quote unquote, the whole concept of death is terrible. And here I am listening and I'm like, I don't usually agree with Donald Trump, but that seems like a fairly reasonable statement, right? So I tweeted that, and then some of my Christian Twitter friends, they said, actually, Shadi, that's one of the more unchristian things Trump has said. That is not a Christian approach to death. And I thought that was really interesting, that something that seems so sensible to the kind of modern secular mind can actually be perceived as rather unchristian. So there's obviously a tension there. And it gets to, I think, a deeper set of issues. And I think, Rusty is right to point out that, death is not something that in secular societies we have a lot of comfort or willingness to talk about openly and frankly. And the default position, I think, as he said, is death should be avoided at any and all costs. But of course, how do you actually implement that in practice? Because theoretically, you could have, I suppose, 0 deaths or something close to 0 deaths if you had a kind of 100% authoritarian lockdown where literally no one would be allowed to leave their homes. But that's actually
but Shadi, then we'd have people dying of heart attacks, people dying of undiagnosed cancer.
Right.
So the fantasy that we can somehow stop death is a very modern fantasy. And I think it's a very dangerous fantasy because it's a license to do terrible things.
And I'm in agreement on that point, and that's why I wouldn't support a kind of Chinese-style authoritarian lockdown. So even people who are in the more aggressively pro-lockdown camp, they are willing to, no one is calling for preventing all deaths at any cost if you take that to its sort of logical extreme. So at some point, we're all dealing with a kind of balancing act about what do we prioritize, and it's a spectrum. And again, I want to move away from this idea of a binary. Most of us are somewhere along a rather continuous spectrum. But on the fear of death, I'll just say one more thing, that another interesting debate that I think has opened up is, to what extent will this crisis, this pandemic, and the increasingly high death toll, is it going to lead people away from religion or towards religion? And I think this is an interesting divide too, because there's people who are on the opposite side of me saying this shows that religion doesn't have much to say. Religion isn't essential, and science is the way forward. I'm of the point of view that if there's ever a time where religion seems more essential, it's precisely in times like this. Because if we're contending with our own mortality, and I'll just, speaking for myself, I have actually thought about death more, partly because I have more time to think about random things. But also, I think all of us are affected. I mean, almost everyone I know, and myself included, we have friends whose relatives or parents have gotten COVID. It's not something that is foreign and remote. We're all somehow tied to this personally because it's affected a lot of Americans, hundreds of thousands of Americans. So in that sense, we have no choice but to actually think about these issues a little bit more. When I'm thinking about my own parents, I'm like, hey, mom and dad, please try to avoid even going to the grocery store. They're in Pennsylvania. And I'm like, really try to avoid any contact. They're old, obviously older, so on and so forth. So we're thinking about these issues in a practical way. And whenever you're thinking about death and mortality, religion always has to figure in, because religion is ultimately the thing that helps us answer the ultimate question. What is the ultimate question? Is about, that which we do not know, or at least we don't know for sure until we're actually facing it. So science and rationality really fall short when we want to go beyond the scientific analysis and we want to talk about what is ultimately important to us, what gives life meaning. That is where the spiritual comes in. And that's where I think religion is going to show itself as being really vital to this moment. And I'm even tempted to think that in the coming 10 to 20 years, we could see something akin to a religious revival, not in Europe. I think we're too late for that in Europe, but perhaps here in the US, a kind of returning to religion as a source of ultimate meaning in a time of crisis.
Yeah, I think the future is unknown, right? I mean, I think Shadi would agree with that. And his speculations, I think, are well grounded. I've been meditating on the biblical notion of crisis, because that's a word, of course, Shadi just used it. It's on all of our lips. And in the New Testament, it's a Greek word that's transliterated directly from Greek, krisis, and it's translated in the New Testament as judgment. And judgment is a time of clarification. Things come out into the open. You know, you go to trial, and the judge determines who is guilty, who is innocent, the sheep from the goats, the wheat from the chaff. And things come into the light. And I'm inclined to think that there'll be a greater, Shadi was worried about this kind of bifurcation between the scientific and the religious. I think it'll actually become more pronounced because we're engaged in a huge global science project of disease control never before tried by human beings. And so it's a massive science endeavor. And a lot of people are very, very, very existentially invested in the success of that project. On the other hand, Shadi's absolutely right. I mean, whoa. I mean, we're talking about fundamental human things here, life and death. And that can't help but evoke in people these kinds of reflections that would lead them to. So it could be that there's a kind of, whether it's a revival, there's a kind of growing, a greater sense of that in this crisis, you wind up coming down more firmly on one side or the other of that divide. Which could be a kind of revival in the sense of people they begin like, whoa, I've been going to church and doing stuff, but wow, man, I actually really believe that stuff. And which can be a very powerful charge, so to speak, to a religious community when people are awakened to the sense that this stuff really does matter. And they believe it's true.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to picture how like a Billy Graham revival would go in today's age. I'm not sure that would go over well, but
yeah,
that's where my mind goes.
And Madison Square Garden meetings are definitely out for the
for the time being, unimaginable completely.
E-revivals.
E-revivals. Well, that's interesting. Rusty, this next question's for you. I've been very interested in what First Things has been publishing recently. Some of your, I think there were journal or diary kind of publications about your experience in New York City. Also a few on why isn't church an essential service? We've talked a bit about, I think, the way that you see society being part of why you would resist kind of this massive shutdown idea as, inherently good or wholly good. I'm also wondering if, as a Catholic, if that kind of contributes in any way more in how you think about church. I have Pentecostal friends that I was talking to recently about, how church went online, and they were thrilled. They were like, we love this because, church is more than a building is kind of the line that, they would toss around, not to characterize anyone, but they're happy with that. Church is more than a building. We can go online. Would you say as a Catholic, there's something that to the materiality of, the space, the meeting, the way you receive grace that has kind of informed this, or is it more about society itself?
There's no question that Catholics are put in the most difficult position by the suspension of public attendance to the Mass. Because for a Catholic, you receive grace on your tongue. So you cannot do that virtually. Now, I'm with Shadi, and I've had these arguments with some of my Catholic friends. Look, that you cannot commune. In the medieval world, people often only communed once a year. And so if it's a 2-month suspension, that's not going to threaten our souls. In some ways, it could deepen it because you could hunger for that communion all the more when it's restored. But I do think it affects the certain kind of, if you will, spiritual anguish that many Catholics feel by the closure of the churches. Yes, I do think it has to do with our distinctive sacramental theology, which is very concrete.
Yeah. Shadi, how would you compare maybe either your experience as a Muslim, or maybe if you could speak for, I know you are a scholar, so you can speak for other people maybe a bit here and there of, how they might approach this. And is it different? Is it, like, oh, how I gave the contrast of, church is not a building, or are there many people, who would say, we are also like very attached to that experience of going to mosque?
Yeah, so the first thing is that for prayer to be communal, you just need more than one person. So theoretically, if you're with your family, or if you have a friend in your building and I guess you're keeping your distance or whatever, there's ways to do the communal prayer, which is considered as having a greater reward in the eyes of God than doing prayer solo. The bigger issue, I suppose, is Friday prayer, which is the main communal weekly event. But luckily, there is precedence for how to deal with fear of harm, and how that should affect or not affect whether or not you go to the Friday prayer. And during the Prophet's lifetime, there were actually situations where there were flash floods, and the Prophet directed the believers, his Muslim followers, to better for them to stay home rather than risk getting hurt or something happening to them during the flooding. So there are these precedents that we can draw on, and I think it's important to remember. Sometimes, like, when you're on Twitter and you're seeing people talk about coronavirus, it's almost as if history just began 2 months ago. But I mean, there have been plagues in history. And so I think, and there have been, mass suffering has actually traditionally, as we know, been worse in pre-modern times. So there's actually a lot that I think all three monotheistic religions, different ways, of course, but they can draw on different precedents of how to deal with the fear of imminent harm. And now there can be a debate about what constitutes imminent harm, that's perhaps a different kind of conversation, and people are going to balance. But so that's one thing. I'll just also mention that and maybe we'll talk about this more later, the communal aspect becomes even more important starting this, I guess, Friday, with the start of the holy month of Ramadan. And there's nothing more communal than that. And some of that is social and not necessarily theological. You can obviously break fast by yourself, but generally speaking, if you're fasting the whole day, you want to be around people, you want to have a celebratory atmosphere. It's a time when family and friends come together. And that's going to be a real challenge, certainly in the Muslim majority world, but also in Muslim minority communities here in the West, that this, you don't always have the opportunity to share in this religious experience, especially if you don't see a lot of Muslims around. So this is the one time that people really come together. And if you don't have that in this one important time of the year, that can be a real spiritual and also a social challenge.
I know Salam she has a great question about Ramadan, but I want to say to everyone attending, who, by the way, thanks for being here. I know that we have people coming, whoever's out there. I know we have some people from Panama, Pakistan, Malaysia, Tunisia, Canada, and the US. We're really impressed by everyone. And we want to hear your questions. Be a part of the audience. Now we're going to be collecting some Q&A, so send in some questions so that we can ask our amazing panelists here. Panelists? That's not the right word. That's a lame word for this. But yeah, send them in. There's a little button at the bottom where you can submit your questions. And on to Salam.
So this is the last question from Chris and I, and you spoke on it a little bit already, but this is directed more towards you, Shadi. So with Ramadan right around the corner, how will Muslims around the world adopt celebrations, especially with Hajj in the distant future?
Yeah, so it's really an interesting question. And certainly in our lifetimes, or really the lifetimes of, I suppose, unless you were alive during the Spanish flu of 1918, but I mean, obviously there's not many people left. And if you were alive, we're maybe like 3 or 4 or something. So in that sense, at least in our lifetimes, this is actually unprecedented. So in that sense, it will present a number of challenges. And I wish I could sort of, predict or offer up some scenarios. I think a lot of it will depend on how quickly the reopening happens. So we're entering into this phase where a number of countries are going to start a gradual, slow reopening, and we'll see whether that's some of that will be instituted towards the end of Ramadan. So there might be more opportunity for communal gathering in some countries where the curve is flattening or hopefully decreasing. But for countries that are really still facing the challenge, you might have a situation where many Muslims have very little communal exposure for the entire month. And that is going to be, I think, a very difficult test. Again, particular for people who live solo. If you are living in, say, Egypt or Jordan, chances are you're not living alone or your family is close by. So you will at least have some people. But obviously in Western countries, you have many Muslims who are living alone in single-person households. And that is not as common in Muslim-majority countries. So that presents a kind of interesting new challenge. And, at the end of the day, people have to adapt. And it's not, in a literal sense, the end of the world. So as difficult as this will be, people will find a way to get through it. And it will be a spiritual test. And generally speaking, how do religious people view these kinds of challenges? They tend to perceive them in the manner of tests from God, and it's a challenge that they want to rise to the occasion, so to speak.
Thanks, Shadi. We're going to move to some Q&A here. We're getting some great questions in. Everybody keep sending them, but Salam, do any stand out to you? Feel free to ask wherever you see.
Oh yes, this is a good one. Let's see if I can. Okay, so how do Christians and Muslims approach human suffering? Is it meaningless or meaningful? And should we avoid it or embrace it? And Rusty, if you want to start off on this one.
Suffering in the Christian perspective can be consecrated to God. St. Paul says that he is filling up the sufferings of Christ, and so it's always possible to turn. In God's providence, God can always turn evil to good. And in our own personal lives, we always have the capacity to turn the evil of suffering to good. So although suffering itself is evil, and it's to be avoided under normal conditions, if we have to endure suffering, we can in fact turn it to good. So in the Christian tradition, obviously Christ's suffering on the cross, there are circumstances of a kind of deep affirmation of suffering as a gift and not as a curse.
So from I won't necessarily give the Islamic perspective, but I'll just give sort of my own reading of how sometimes Muslims debate these issues. And there is quite a bit of internal disagreement on how much to emphasize free will. There is a challenging debate on that, which is probably beyond our scope here. But, this is a question of theodicy, the problem of evil. Why does God permit evil in this world? And this has been a really fundamental question for millennia, because there has always been evil, there has always been suffering, and the challenge then for human beings is to try to make sense of that. So the question that I hear oftentimes these days is, if God is all good and God is all powerful, how does he allow the suffering that we're seeing right now with coronavirus? Why doesn't he stop it? Why doesn't he find ways to prevent it? I've always found that kind of reasoning a little bit baffling, and this is just me speaking as me, in the sense that if there is free will, that means that when the Chinese authorities suppressed information and tried to cover up the virus in the initial stages, it wouldn't have really made sense in the context of free will for God to stop the Chinese Communist Party from doing that, because that would be a violation of individual free will, right? If people, unfortunately, eat wildlife and bats and from the wet markets, and that's a small minority of people in China, but it exists. God can, in theory, intervene if he willed, if he wished it to be so. But again, God isn't necessarily intervening daily and stopping bad things from happening, because if he did that, that would undermine one of the bedrocks of religion, which is choice. That you can't have accountability, and the concept of sin falls apart if God deprives us of choice, because otherwise, how would he be able to judge the good from the bad, and to good deeds from sins, and so on? So there has to be some aspect where human beings make their own choices, and then after they make those choices, God then holds them accountable.
Thank you so much to both of you. We have another great question. I'm going to click answer live and see what happens. From Ahmad Hamid, who I don't know is probably not related to Shadi, but could have been a funny joke. He says, some people say that the virus pandemic is a punishment from God for our sins. This seems like a great question for people of different faiths, and I wonder how you will respond. So either of you, go ahead.
It's hard to speculate about God's providence. I would say, you could say this, though, that back to this question about suffering, but there isn't, punishment is another word of it might be chastisement. We do have fantasies of our own immortality, our own invulnerability, and certainly suffering is a reminder of our finitude, that we are not in fact masters of our own fate, much as we would like to imagine, and that we cannot control the future, hard as we might try. And so I think it's quite reasonable to think of the pandemic as a chastisement of that sort. A pedagogy. All of God's punishments in the Bible have two sides to them. In other words, and death itself is a punishment for the Adam and Eve's first sin. That death is its own consolation. It has two sides. Of course, it's a great evil to be avoided, but it's also a limit on our evil. If Hitler had never died, if human beings didn't die, then there would be no end to the damage that we would do to ourselves and to others. So it has both sides, and suffering also, and the pandemic, I think, has those two sides. Rightfully to be resisted, rightfully to seek a cure, right to seek a vaccine, but also at the same time, it's quite possible to see it as having a positive, or having serving a divine purpose that's ultimately for the good.
Yeah. So Chris, you joked that, hey, is this one of my relatives? I'm not 100% sure, but it could very well be my dad. That is my dad's name. I am impressed. If it is him, I am impressed that he figured out how to use the Zoom Q&A function, which is very advanced technology.
We got him.
But my dad and I have talked about this, that you do sometimes. You do hear in various parts of the world this kind of self-serving response to suffering, and specifically to this virus, where people are trying to read more, they're trying to read into God's will. And in that sense, they are violating the humility that I would say that all humans and certainly believers should have in divining God's will, and we have to be careful about that. But we do see people who are doing this kind of, let's call it an advanced reading of the virus, that is punishment for whoever they don't like. And there's a kind of corollary to this, that I'm born and raised in Pennsylvania, but originally Egyptian, and my parents are in regular touch with their with some of our relatives in Egypt. And there's also this related issue of conspiracy theories, where again, people are trying to take and they're quite rampant in Egypt, unfortunately. And some of them are rather creative, and that probably speaks well in a way to the creativity of some of my Egyptian relatives. But but it does show that people, again, we get to this question of, in times of suffering, in times of crisis, people are grasping for straws, and they want to create meaning where meaning doesn't exist. Where I would argue that the more sort of religiously sound approach is to accept that which we do not know. And it's okay if we don't know exactly how the virus started. Instead of coming up with some conspiracy theory about how Americans manufactured this in some lab. And that's actually, I should say, because it is something to be very concerned about as Americans, these conspiracy theories that put the blame on America are actually becoming the predominant narrative, not just in parts of the Muslim world, but also elsewhere. And Chinese propaganda is contributing to that. So just as a kind of side note to be aware of. But I would say that, the last thing I'll say on this point is, I'm not a big fan of this. I don't like cliches in general, but one cliche I don't like is everything happens for a reason. Does everything happen for a reason? Maybe in some kind of broader metaphysical sense, but we as human beings, as mere human beings, don't necessarily have any direct access to what that greater wisdom is. So at some level, we have to take a step back and kind of suspend our own interpretations, because we don't really know why a lot of things happen at the end of the day.
I keep telling my wife that God made the coronavirus happen so that I would finish my dissertation, because it's been very effective. I don't know if you're working on books, but this works. This stuff works. Indoors only.
So this is a good one from Vikram Peters. So it's tailored towards Muslims. So from where does the Muslim faith draw hope as we live through the pandemic? Rather, does Islam have a doctrine of hope, and what is it? But I also would love to hear the Christian perspective as well. So Rusty, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, Rusty, do you want to start on the Christian approach?
Well, for there's a personal hope, and then there's a kind of collective hope. And the Christian hope is that death is not the final word. And so that kind of changes everything if that hope is deep-seated in terms of how you face the challenges of the present moment, both personally, but also then collectively. Hope is that ultimately, as the book of Revelation says, drawing from the prophecies of Isaiah, that in the age to come, God wipes away tears from every eye. And so that, God, in some sense, rectifies the evil and suffering of the world. And that kind of hope can provide a deep consolation in the face of collective tribulations far greater than this one. That's the general Christian view.
Yeah, and it's similar from a Muslim perspective, and I would say that generally, certainly the monotheistic religions share this sensibility that this life is temporary. That would be the traditional sort of monotheistic view. I would say that we are sort of we are passing through. And in the broader sweep of humankind and in the broader sweep of the universe, we are but a dot, and in that sense, if we keep things in perspective, this life is a contrast to what is eternal. And what would be eternal here is the afterlife. Judaism is a bit different in terms of how it conceives of heaven and hell. And certainly there are differences as well between Christianity and Islam, but there is certainly, Christians and Muslims do share this conception of some kind of eternal life, of paradise, and that believers, at least in theory, obviously this is hard to do in practice, but in theory, believers should, keep keep the perspective that there is a life to come. And, if we're talking about hope, that's where at least some hope would come. And obviously, and even just saying it now, because I should clarify, I'm not a theologian. I'm a political scientist who studies religion's role in public life, and specifically Islam's role. And because I often talk in secular terms as a political scientist and to largely oftentimes secular audiences, it strikes me how odd that must sound to the secular ear. And I wonder, from a secular standpoint, whether this kind of approach to hope would sound naive and even silly, but that is a traditional religious approach to these questions.
I have a final question, which is coming from a little bit of a Noma. You asked a great question here that I want to rephrase and ask. As we are looking at a lot of changes in the way that we worship, people are no longer doing kind of the communal aspect of worship. Is something going to change when we all go back to church and mosque in our respective houses of worship? Do you think something's been accelerated in kind of that individual aspect of religion that I think maybe for me, I even see like a creeping secularity when people are like, well, I can go on a hike and be with God rather than go to church or go to mosque. And do you see what I mean? Do you think that church and mosque and these communal places of worship are going to have a hard time getting everyone back in the door? Has something changed?
That's a danger, no doubt. I mean, we're creatures of habit. And if we get in the habit of not going to church, then it increases the likelihood that we won't when it all opens up. I would counsel this. I think that religious communities need to take the lead in restoring community, and that means being the first to set aside all the fear about causing the deaths of others, being the source of the pandemic. Because I think that as we open up, people are going to be very hungry for the warmth of others. And if the churches are following behind the bars and behind the nightclubs, then I think it'll be a tragic outcome. But there's a great opportunity here for the church to take the lead of being a focal point for people to restore community, restore sociality, because we're made to be with each other. We're not made to be alone.
Yeah, so I would say on that, this is one of those things too, where we're having this debate about how much coronavirus will change us whenever after is. And again, I sort of see two very different responses from people I know. And even inside of myself, I feel I'm kind of torn and I go back and forth. I mean, one school of thought is that nothing will ever be the same. Everything has changed school of thought. And again, my criticism of that would be, history didn't begin 2 months ago. Like this sort of this very presentist approach where we think that this is everything and we can't remove ourselves from the moment. Then there's another school of thought that says human beings are human beings. It's very difficult to change who we are in our basic nature. And we crave normalcy and we'll want to go right back to the way things were before, and we're forgetful and our memories are short, and that and even if we look at how people remembered Spanish flu, there wasn't a real reckoning after Spanish flu, and various writers have written about how there isn't really a post-Spanish flu literature. There aren't great works. There aren't great novels. There are some nonfiction studies, but more recently. So in some sense, people very quickly moved back into a normal way of living and a normal way of writing and observing and perceiving. And that tells us something about the human adaptability to suffering, to crisis, that crisis is painful, and we want to find ways to grasp what we used to know and what gives us comfort, and that's largely from our past life or our pre-virus life. So in some sense, I'm torn between those two impulses, but obviously, as I suggested, I lean more towards the, hey, not everything has changed, not everything will change, and we crave normalcy. Now the question is, what does normalcy mean today? And that's an interesting debate in of itself. I don't even know now, like if you ask me, hey, Shadi, what is normal? I don't know exactly how I would respond to that, because my sense of normalcy has itself been distorted.
Yeah, I think when we all see each other again, we're not going to know how to talk. I've had this when I see someone in the street. It's like, I haven't talked to someone in a long time. Hopefully when it all gets back, it will be normal. And everyone, with that, I want to say thank you for coming. We're toward the end of our time. We try to keep things to 45 minutes so that everyone can get back to their dinners, and to make sure that you guys want to come next time, because we really keep a tight schedule, folks. And I want to tell you about next time. We are having another event in about a week called Finding Light in a Dark Place, featuring Jen Pullock-Michael, who you can Google. We'll send you posters, and Yasmin El Hadi. We're going to talk about what are some of the bright spots right now that we can be focusing on as Christians and Muslims. How do they differ? And maybe can we learn something from one another? So wherever you are, give a little snap or clap for RR or Rusty Reno and Shadi Hamid for joining us. And again, we're Neighborly Faith. Follow us online on Facebook for invites to these kinds of things. And thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Good to be with you, Chris. Salam. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night. Have a good night, everyone. Okay. Ciao. We'll be in touch.
Right. in the flesh next time.
I hope. Yeah.
In the flesh. Oh, yes. Yes.
Bye, Chris.
Cool. Bye. Thanks, Shadi.